top, the middle of the day tea, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. We're at the bench for another little narrative session, kind of in a follow-up application on the Echo 620 that we see right here in the foreground. Throwing the disclaimers out right off the bat. This is going to be a narrative, long and tedious if you're not interested in minutia. Well, a little bit of minutia anyway. The little bit that I can conjure up in this process. But if you're not that type, you don't have that personality type, you're going to find this to be probably tedious and even boring. So there you go. Disclaimers revolve around me slammering my speech. That's a combination of slur and stammer. Check the description for any clarifications, qualifications, corrections. I'm only human. I make mistakes. And if I find that I'm making mistakes, I correct myself in the description area. As far as slammering, please forgive me if I actually do that in this process. So if we want to talk about the two guests of honor, we have an MS-362 standard on the left and it's a CS-620 PW Echo on the right. Now, there's a 1 pound difference between the two of these saws, empty and full. I thought I'd throw that out there. So if we're looking at some of the parts, accoutrements, if you will, on these two saws to see what's happening. They're both came in quote-unquote West Coast trim, so they had 3/4 wrap handlebars, and they had the bigger double dog set that they come with from the factory. So they're exactly the same in that regard, which I thought was really cool. So clutch cover in the Echo is completely metal. 345 grams it says. It has a decent sized dust flap. It's really smooth inside here, except down on this bottom lip it actually like comes around and kicks in. It kicks in. So like, I don't know if they're trying to direct the flow of traffic right there, but you really want it to kick out, because that's going to be a situation where over time stuff's going to build up in there. The paint's going to come off. You're going to throw your chain, and you're just going to end up with buildup. Canting away is a much better concept and idea. So I think I mentioned this in the just total Echo 620 bench talk. You got to be careful when you take off this outside bar plate, which it actually came with one, which I thought was really cool. The Echo, I see Husqvarna, I see Stihl, and I see Dolmar stuff in this saw. I don't know if it's completely coincidental, but I see all kinds of the influence of those three other brands in this particular saw. Hopefully I remember to address all those as we go along. All the fasteners, bolts, whatever, are 27 Torx, same as Stihl, and now coming on a bunch of the Husqvarnas in some of the bolt sizes. I mean, there's some smaller bolts that run 20 Torx, but the bulk of the newer stuff is coming in 27 as well. But you got to be careful. The worm gear and the chain tensioner, they're kind of just laying in there loose. If you take this bar plate off, they'll fall right out. So we established this is about 345 grams. Let's take a look at what we have with the Stihl, shall we? So this weighs 299, 300, depends on how it's positioned. So let's just go with 300. I seen one that was a little bit higher. I seen a weight that was a little bit lower, 299 to 301. So we've saved 45 grams just in this particular situation right here, but this clutch cover from the Echo has the chain tensioning system and the Stihl does not. So 50 grams or so, 45 grams of difference. 28 grams is an ounce. you're not going to pick up all of that in the chain tensioning, so there's a weight savings right there. If we look at the recoil assemblies or pull starter covers, 292 versus 312. So we're 20 grams heavier essentially with the recoil assemblies. It's kind of interesting. Every part of the equation seems to be a little bit heavier in the Echo. If we look at single, Stihl's redesigned their stuff now. Cylinder cover, carb box cover combo, 201 grams. If we look at the Echo, it's more like what the older stuff was designed, two-piece situation. It's going to be heavier, I can guarantee you that, and I don't even know what it is and haven't checked it yet myself. 213 versus 200, essentially it's looking like this time. $214. So essentially what we're seeing is every part of the equation that we check out is heavier. This is the front of the carb box, bottom of the carb box. There's not really a part I could take apart. It's kind of part of the tank. The carburetor on the 620 is kind of independent. It's actually, you can see it from the outside of the saw when everything is in place. 83 grams for that. This one's going to be less because it's a lot smaller, 67. There's some interesting parts of the equation to hold the carburetor on. On the 362, 84 grams. It doesn't have quite the same setup on the Echo. It's kind of this piece right here essentially, and then there's this other plastic piece right here that's part of the tank that I can't actually weigh. Cartridge style, round, twist on. I think I mentioned this in some other videos. Stihl Incorporated recommends that you swap these out every 30 days of use. That's what they recommend. 32 grams versus 36 grams. So the air cleaners themselves are relatively close to the same weight. The carburetor system's completely different situation. We're stratifying the system in the Stihl. So we have raw air going in on the top, we have raw air coming in on the bottom, but it's getting mixed with fuel. 147 grams. In the Echo, it's a standard version saw. There's no air injection, no stratification process. We have a actually really big venturi rolling through this. A lot of potential for flow in this saw. Limiter caps. Looks like a standard old school carburetor for the most part. 131. So it's a little bit lighter, but not really much. 133 it says this time versus 146. So my scales aren't like perfect. Nothing that I have is weights and measure accurate, of course. That's not the way this is rolling in my shop. We're just checking out, trying to get relative numbers. Now, they use a stainless two-piece. This is the muffler. This is the casing for the 362. I'm going to go with exponentially lighter than what we see in the Echo. It's 238 at that point. And I didn't weigh it with the, they don't actually use a cooling plate, they just have a muffler gasket. 243, 242, consistent with 242. The Echo system's way heavier. It's going to be, I don't even know, I'm going to guess 2.5 ounces heavier. 353 essentially. So it's kind of an interesting concept. A lot of extra weight. There's what would be considered the intake manifold for the 362, 35 versus 17, so it weighs half essentially. The one thing I will say is the rubber is an interesting, it has an interesting feel to it. It's like super soft. It's not very stiff. So the guide for the screwdriver is really flexible. The hoses are really flexible. The side of the tank right here that holds this little guide for your screwdriver is really flexible. Not sure what kind of plastic they're using, of course, because I don't get to talk to those people that make those decisions and know that information, I guess, know the answer to those questions. So if we look inside, we see a lot of monkey business it takes to get the Stihl apart. If we look at what's going on with the Echo, it's half. There's not a lot of monkey business. The handlebars fall right off on the Echo, which they're a 3/4 wrap system, real similar to what we see. Here's the 362. Here is the 620. They're very similar in concept and design, 3/4 wrap. Now, the Stihl's running the upper spring mount off of the handlebar right here. And one of the things I noticed is that there is a big piece of metal sticking up right here that's holding that rear spring mount. So I'm thinking if you're thinking about weight savings, you're not doing it this way. You're adding the spring mount to the side of the cylinder like what the Husqvarnas are doing, and you're basically shaping your handlebars to correspond or work with that kind of a design. You want to segue off on the Husqvarna thing. 562s have these little nylon straps here, or whatever they are, some kind of woven material. I'm assuming it's nylon. Who knows what it is. Keeps the saw from moving too far and putting a lot of pressure and breaking that spring, I guess. The other thing I notice is the coil is way up here. Another big, huge piece of, well, it's not very heavy when they're using magnesium, but conceptually you end up with a lot of extra weight in the process when you put a big piece of metal up over here to support the coil. Changes the balance quite a bit when the coil's up high and off in the front too. A lot of times the Stihls are running it back down here. Husqvarnas have them up in the front sometimes. They tend to be a little bit longer saw. We got this kind of interesting air guide, but you can see that the rubber is really flexible. It's kind of interesting. I wonder how it's going to perform in the cold. Alright, so we looked at kind of the outward stuff with these two saws, and we checked some stuff out. Oh, we didn't look at the differential and where that fuel's going through. So in the Echo, it's huge for a little 60cc saw. It's really choked down in the Stihl. I ran these two in stock form against each other, and the times are relatively close, but they have a completely different feel. The Echo actually has good low end. The Stihl is all on the top from what I can tell through feel. It's really hard watching that through a computer monitor to get an idea on what that actually would feel like. But I think I mentioned in the saw video, which we'll probably see that before this. I don't know how it's going to work out, but definitely has a different feel in the process. The Echo is definitely different. The other thing I noticed is the chain brake handle is huge on this little saw. I didn't take it off to weigh it, but it's huge. So standard old style, no full circle operation going on in the bottom of the crankcase. We can see the reliefs that work with the intake design system of the quad loop for the cylinder itself. It actually does have a metal flywheel double magnet system. this is a limited coil, but it's not an M-tronic system, since we have needles essentially in the carburetor for adjusting the high and low speed circuits to a degree, since there's stops. I kind of was checking out the bearings in these saws. They're pretty good size for little mini saws, which I was kind of impressed with the actual size of the crank bearings in there. Now if we do a rudimentary, just kind of eyeballing it, which sometimes you have to in this life, right? It seems like they are about 35. I got 35.61 just eyeballing. And if we look at a 6203 bearing, they're 35. Generally, this size of bearing is what's seen in a lot of the 70cc class saws. And these are 60, so I thought that was kind of interesting in a good way. If we take a look at the crankcase, one thing I kind of forgot to mention is we're canted back a little bit in the 362. I've seen them canted further back in a lot of the Stihl saws. Husqvarna has a tendency to run them kind of flat. The Echo is slanted way back, so they were trying to get the charge coming in, I'm assuming, down, and having the exhaust coming down to work with the dynamics that are happening with the pressure in the system. Vacuum is what's drawing the charge into the crankcase, but I think that's probably what the concept was. If we take a look at the bearing on the Echo as well, like I said, we're just kind of winging it with what I can tell through this process of estimation. We have about 33, but this is a little bit harder to see than what we had in the Stihl. So essentially they're both sporting the 6202 size bearings, which I mentioned was a kind of a big kid saw in a lot of respects, bearing size. We kind of looked at this saw. Metal flywheel, I'm going to go with that thing weighs a fair amount. Coils mounted up on the top, but the Dolmar S kind of concept that I was talking about is the rod is super long. 34 millimeter stroke, 32 millimeter stroke, a little bit more low end, kind of makes sense. The long rod's going to affect the dwell time, which is the amount of time that the piston kind of spins at top dead center. The longer that it takes for the piston to get rolling through the process, coming up on top dead center, being at top dead center, and then starting down over past top dead center, that amount of time is dwell time, I guess, essentially. Top dead center, I guess, technically. But the longer that time frame, the more the charge has a chance to act on the top of the piston, I guess, essentially. So a lot of race application engines use a long rod and a piston that's got a pretty short compression height. So I just thought I'd throw that out there. So we saw a little bit of Husqvarna conceptually ideas here and there. We saw like a Dolmar situation. The rod's really skinny and it's really long. A lot of their saws, the newer ones anyway, they have a pretty short compression height. That's the distance from the center line of the wrist pin to the top of the outside of the edge of the piston dome, essentially. I want to talk about that for a second. So essentially center line, wrist pin to the outside edge of the dome's compression height. I always called it the deck height, but I'm not really quote unquote serious car engine guy, so I was mistaken. Had to get a clarification from Mr. Speed and Marine, since he's engine builder extraordinaire, I guess, essentially. But back on track. An interesting platform, old school for sure. If we were to take a look at the cylinders for a second, I'm going to have to get this spliced into the process. So one thing that I thought was really interesting is the bolts are very similar. They're just a different color. They're both 27 Torx. Essentially, overall length is the same at 30, essentially, 30 millimeters. I was curious to see if they're close to the same material, and they weigh exactly the same. So, interesting concept. That's what's holding the cylinder on to the cases, those 4 bolts. Run that thing back to 0. I have not weighed this cylinder in a while. I could not remember what it was. 596 grams versus 540 grams. So quite a bit more weight, but this is a air leak sauce, so they run hot. You're going to have a little bit more material. The fins are a lot thicker. They're probably twice as thick on the 362. Now, it's kind of an interesting concept with the quad loop system in the 620 Echo. It's like a little mini version XPW 372 in some regards. If we look at the back of the transfer port, we can see that the back circuit is way huge where it dumps into the cylinder, as opposed to, and if I can find my flashlight really quick in this process, it's way huge in the back of the cylinder compared to what we see up in the front. It's over twice as big. So they're definitely trying to direct the charge as it's heading into the process. I would imagine as it's going across the top of the piston that they're trying to get the scavenging to work well. That would be my guess. It's got a pretty big combustion chamber. I didn't see the thing, but looking in there I can tell that it's actually pretty big. Oval exhaust coming out. It's kind of oblong, but it's real narrow, and it's completely round. Now, we've seen in the 462 where it's not exactly round, it's kind of a little bit square, but it's tilted. This one's more like what you see in a motorcycle application. We look at the back of the cylinder, we're looking at the start of the intake circuit right here. It's really rectangular shape, goes into kind of a little bit of an oval on the back of the cylinder. Standard decompression valve up in the top. A lot of the machines are doing that nowadays. If we look at the 362 cylinder, we've looked in here before. It has a quad loop system fed by the 4 independent ports, and they're real long this way across the top of where the charge is dumping into the cylinder, across the top of the piston. The fresh air port is huge as well. But if we look at the intake side, we can see the stratification circuit air goes in here, but the intake part where the quote-unquote charge is headed is actually really small in comparison. I mean, you can see the differential there. I'm thinking it's over twice as big in what we see in the Echo. checking out the exhaust. It's really wide compared to what we see in the Echo, which is going to help with the process. The duration's not very great, but it's taking it from a large cross-section across the top of the piston in the 362. I'm thinking that you can see that down in there. We'll review on the Echo real quick. It's taller, but it's more narrow. Now, one thing that I didn't talk about too much is the differential in the way they feel. It's impossible to tell through a computer monitor what that's like. If we're looking at the differential in the way they run, the 362 is all top end. They have a short stroke and a big bore. I think it's a 32 millimeter stroke by 57, yeah, it's 57 millimeter bore essentially, and the 620 has a 34 millimeter stroke, but it only has a 45 millimeter bore. So they're going for a little bit different concept. You can feel the difference in the Echo when you're sawing. It definitely has more low end. I think the timed runs were relatively close between these two in completely bone stock form. I think we mentioned the weight. The Echo's a pound heavier exactly. It's 12.3 in West Coast trim on the 362, and it's 13.3 on the Echo in West Coast trim. So it's kind of heavy for a 60cc saw in a lot of regards. I think it's pretty much the same as the 562 Husqvarna, but with the 462 introduction, 13 pound, it weighs a little bit more than that in West Coast trim, but they're pretty close to the 60cc saw, and they're 12 cc's more. The good thing about the Echo is the price point. They're kind of just giving them away. We want to talk about the pistons for a minute. We're going to check them out weight-wise. The Echo weighs 66 grams, and the 362 Stihl weighs 80 grams. So quite a bit of difference in the reciprocating mass that's rolling around. The Echo sporting a 10 millimeter pin. Let's weigh the assembly here and see what we end up with. So overall we're at about 88 grams. If we take a look at the 362 components, we end up with 96 grams. Part of what's happening is we have the standard operating procedure 12-inch wrist pin, but it's actually tapered. It's thin on this outside edge, and it gradually gets bigger in here where the bearing resides. So they definitely have a better thought process for performance conceptually between those two. If we take a look at the wrist pin, it's actually really wide, and the needle bearings are 78 thousandths. So it's kind of interesting in that regard. If we take a peek at the wrist pin bearing in the 362, it is a lot, well, we better compare them, I guess, at the same time. It's not as wide, and it has a few more needle bearings, but they're the 58 thousandths in diameter size. So 78 thousandths is what we're looking at in the Echo, and we're looking at 58 thousandths in the MS362. So some differentials in engine design. Again, the weight's a lot more in the Echo. There are places where I think that a person should think about saving weight in this process, and there are places in this process where I think that people should not be trying to save weight. I kind of like the concept of the wrist pin bearing being beefy on a personal level. you're spinning around about 100 grams worth of weight, so essentially you're getting into that 30 ounces in both of them for the piston assemblies, if you will. I kind of got to segue back for a second because I just thought of something on airflow. So essentially in the Stihl you have this cartridge style filter, and you got a quarter twist throttle concept where it engages with this little plastic stud that sticks up in there. Part of the reason probably why they want you replacing it pretty often is it gets loose from vibration, but we can see what's happening here with the airflow. Now part of that is dispersing noise too, air noise. There are decibel limits that saws can have as far as the upper threshold, and so a lot of times they're running baffles that diffuse that that noise of the air rolling through the process. I thought maybe, I don't know if I'd ever said anything about that before, but maybe we should talk about it now. So inside the air cleaner for the Echo is this little system here, which they have a support, but it's offset. So they're trying to get something happening there, I think, or maybe they found out later that that needed some help because the stud goes through like this, and they didn't want to be crushing that element. I mean, I don't know what the deal is, but I thought that was noteworthy. We have an offset situation happening there. Okay. Now, I think we kind of got everything covered. I can't think of anything else that needs to be addressed right this second. We may have to add stuff in here as time goes on, as I start getting more involved in dealing with the, I guess, the build sequence, technically. One thing that I forgot to talk about was the size of the exhaust outlet. So it's pretty small in stock form. You can see it right there. That's all the bigger the hole is. And in there, it's not even the size of a dime, but it's bigger than a pencil. So it's about that big around. I'm thinking it's about 3/8 in diameter, the actual outlet. So with the concept of the M-tronic, even though this isn't, that muffler also goes on the M-tronic saws, they're trying to limit the amount of hydrocarbons getting out, and so they run hot with the air injection, and essentially they're trying to achieve a perfect burn relationship, that stoichiometric ratio of 14.7 air molecules to one fuel molecule. They're trying to keep that process, probably help that process in the muffler, and keep the emissions a little bit low, I guess, essentially. Now, I'm not sure what the deal is on the credit situation for the Echo company. You can have some dirty saws. When you have enough saws that run clean, you get credits for the clean running saws. I don't know much about their situation or what they have going on. I haven't really looked into the Echo line that much, but we want to look at the back of the muffler essentially, and we actually have a nice big old huge hole. I've already started working on the deflector of the Echo, so I got one on order, a new outlet and some other things, and so we'll have to introduce a little bit of information in that regard as time goes on. But like, if you look at the concept, I mean, they're probably relatively close to the same amount of surface area if you just did a up and down relationship. But the outlet on the Echo is interesting. It comes up and goes in and comes out. So they're slowing it down essentially and dispersing it. We'll segue off into when I first tore this saw down now. No idea what we're going to find in here, so let's take a look. Well, I don't know if that's actually entirely accurate, but let's take a look for those of us that don't understand what's going on in here. I guess haven't ever seen what's going on in here. So it goes in, comes out, has to hook around and go out. So not super efficient for flow necessarily. Huge fire screen, that's awesome. And there's just a round tube coming out of there. We got a chance to look at it initially then and take a look at that whole situation. So flow characteristics in 620 Echo are much better for making power, in my humble opinion. I'm going to go on record and say that in zip form, the 620 is going to mop up on the MS362. Doesn't matter if you're talking standard or not. It's gonna, you do the equal level of work to both of them, same amount of work, same level if you will. The 620 is going to beat up on it, but it's a pound heavier, so let's hope that it does that, because if it's not and it's a pound heavier, that's going to be sad. I think this saw, if it weighed 8 ounces less, if it weighed 6 to 8 ounces more than the Stihl, it'd be a force definitely to be reckoned with. The mounting system on the chain brake handle is like really involved. It's more excessive than it needs to be from what I've seen. When you're going at stuff, you get carte blanche, you know. You kind of have a Stihl style in a conceptual way. Tank vent, like I said, there's some Husqvarna stuff in this, and there's some Stihl stuff. One thing I'll mention, handlebars are super pain to get off of the 362, and they are not hard at all to get off of the Echo. They're actually really easy. They're like a 660 or a 372. Doesn't take much, and they're off in your hands. So I do like the setup on these handlebars though. Okay, kind of got everything covered, I think, I hope. Now the fun's going to start happening as I start to go through the process of building these two machines. So, thanks for watching this session. Have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.